topic that we have for you tonight is User Guide for the Intellect. Everything depends upon the intellect. So what is the intellect and how do you use it properly? How should you maintain it? What is a divine intellect? What is overuse of the intellect or misuse of the intellect? I'm hoping you can look at some of these things tonight as well and really enlighten us on what to do with this thing called intellect. So thank you and welcome again.
Thank you so much, Yogesh, and it's lovely to be with everyone this evening. Well, we've all been through the introduction course, and the first thing we learn is that a soul has three elements, which are the mind, the intellect, and the sanskaras. And the symbol for the intellect is given as the scales, and so the intellect is all about balancing one thing against another thing and arriving at a good judgment. So this is the essential function of the intellect. I also consider that the intellect and conscience are connected. And in Hindi, the word for this is buddhi, and you can translate buddhi in a number of ways. So in English, we can use intelligence, evaluation, judgment, conscience, reasoning. There are a number of different words which are all to do with thinking to arrive at a conclusion. And this is differentiated from the mind, and the mind is like one more organ of sense perception, except that it will perceive things that you cannot perceive through the senses. So sometimes it can be called the sixth sense. All the emotions are there in the mind. And so the intellect, by comparison with the mind, is considered as more of a calculating aspect of consciousness. The intellect is that part of the consciousness that we use for focusing. And so meditation is about focusing. So the intellect does the job of focusing, but it wants to focus the mind, because the mind tends to get distracted very easily. So the intellect will focus the mind so that the mind can perceive, because the intellect cannot perceive anything, only the mind can perceive something. So you want to be able to perceive yourself as a soul, and so you can understand yourself as a soul with the intellect, but you cannot perceive yourself as a soul with the intellect. That you must do with the mind. So these two are different capacities of the soul, and they're very deep and very subtle, and we often talk about them as if they're completely understandable, but I think that they are not so easily understandable as we tend to interact with them as if they are very clear and very easy. So a user guide to the intellect. Because this is so subtle, different people have different take on what these things are. And they are defined differently by different people. So there's a lot of variation in interpretation because these are very subtle. And they are faculties of the soul. And of course every soul is individual, every soul is ultra subtle and very difficult to grasp, quite honestly. So the user guide to the intellect. What should we do with this thing called intellect. So we have to apply the intellect when we want to figure something out. When we want to make choices, we have to take into consideration all the elements and make an evaluation and then choose. But there are many things that the mind will perceive that the intellect cannot grasp. And there's a very beautiful French saying which I think is quite pertinent here. It says, "Le cœur a ses raisons que la raison ne connaît pas," which means the heart has its reasons which reason doesn't know anything about. And we learn about the intellect not for the purpose of studying academic matters, but we are learning about the intellect in the context of spiritual practice. And why we are learning about this is because, first of all, we're learning about consciousness. And in the world of materialism, consciousness is thought of as a byproduct of the brain. Whereas in the world of spirituality, the brain is a byproduct of consciousness. So it's really, everything is the other way around and quite inverted. But here we're focusing on the self, using the capability of concentration to focus our mind, our capacity for perception on the self, which cannot be perceived by the regular instruments of perception. You cannot see the soul, you cannot hear it, you cannot taste it or touch it or smell it. The soul can be understood. So the first duty of the intellect is to understand that there are realities that are beyond the range of sense perception. And the first reality is your own self, the soul. And we generally say, I have a soul. And for us to change and say, I am not a man, not a woman, not a body, not a culture, I'm a being, I'm invisible, I'm immortal, I cannot be destroyed. Shifting into that consciousness begins with the intellect taking in information. So the intellect is for holding information, organizing that information, processing it. And then the intellect basically gives it to the mind, which feels it. And so the mind and the intellect work together. Sometimes I make an analogy with the eyes, because our eyes have two kinds of cells. There's one sort of cell which deals with form and shape, and the other ones are dealing with color. So the intellect is like the form and the shape, the details, the architecture, the calculations. And the mind is the color, the feeling, the mood, these type of things. So it all works together, and that becomes the way that we experience reality. And when you go a little deep into spirituality, you begin to get the idea that all experiences take place inside, in your mind, in your soul. and yet we have the feeling that they're happening outside in what we call the real world. So we have to think about that. And with the intellect, we say, okay, now what does this mean? What does this imply? How do I do this? How do I determine whether I'm doing it right or not right? Do I really understand this? How do I deal with paradox and things which are contradictory? There are many contradictory things in this world. So we begin our inquiries really by applying the intellect. And as you know, there's different kinds of people, and one division is the left brain people in comparison with the right brain people. And in terms of the intellect, the left brain people are the ones who are really intellect-minded, and the right brain people are more mental-minded, more to do with perception than calculation. And so therefore the right brain people and the left brain people very often do not see eye to eye. They do not learn in the same way. It's similar to in school, where they kind of divide people up into the scientific types and the artistic types. I don't know if they still do that. But when I was young, it used to be that kind of division. And the world we're living in is generally described as a materialist world, and people study for the purpose of getting qualifications so that they can get a job, so that they can make money. And if you have a lot of money, then you will be able to buy things, and then you'll be happy. And sometimes you are, and sometimes you aren't. So the intellect is given a lot of importance in what we call the Western world. And in spirituality, the intellect is given importance because it's more stable than the mind, it's unchangeable. For example, 2 + 2 is always 4, whether it's day or night, or a good day or a bad day, or you're feeling sick or you're feeling well, or you're happy or unhappy. It doesn't change the facts. And when you are interpreting things in terms of the mind, 2 + 2 = 4, who cares? Or yes, it's very important. You bring in the whole aspect of attitude and feeling, and other more intangible things which waver and vary. Your feelings are all part of this. So the intellect is given importance because it is an instrument for creating stability. And we live in very unstable times. There's a lot of conspiracy theories and fake news around the place. And so we need to use our intellect, but sometimes we don't get enough information. And instead of using the intellect, we use the mind. You know, if it sounds right, it probably is right, but no. The intellect will say, well, we have to check it. We have to analyze it. Just because it sounds good doesn't mean it is good. So you can see I'm looking at the intellect by comparing it to the mind, because very often you can understand something a little better by comparing it to something else which is quite different to it. You asked about overuse of the intellect, and In spirituality, it's always told to us the importance of balance. And if you're overthinking, that maybe the mind is overactive, or it could just as easily be the intellect is analyzing something to death, as we say. So there comes a point where you need to operate on the basis of optimum rather than maximum. And this is something that the intellect needs to recognize, that you look at something, you analyze something, you think about something only to the point where it gets easier by continuing to think about it, or it gets clearer. But as soon as it starts becoming less clear and less easy and more complicated, then you have gone past that point of optimum, and you will go off in the direction of maximum, which is really counterproductive. So optimum is a very important thing that the intellect has to recognize. So this word recognition is important with the intellect. What is recognition? There is one of the powers in the 8 powers of Raj Yoga, and that power is called the power of discrimination, also called the power of discernment. And this is a power of the intellect to recognize. And the intellect has to be applied to different situations, different things that come in front of you, to determine, is this real or fake? Is this valuable? If so, how valuable? You use this power of discrimination to prioritize what's more important, what's less important. At certain times you may have decided upon something based upon your existing criteria and the information available to you, but then subsequently more information may be placed in front of you, and you may need to change your determination, because the intellect has to recognize that it had not taken into consideration certain things. So then you take them into consideration, and you make an amended assessment. So these two aspects, called judgment and discrimination, are functions of the intellect. Now these two words, discrimination and judgment, are loaded words, and because they're loaded, people have emotional reactions to them. And this is because language is very dynamic, and it changes, it gets used in different ways from its actual meaning, and then it acquires a charge because of how certain words are used. And these two words have this charge. And because of that, I would like to talk about that a little bit. Generally speaking, people use the word discrimination to mean something negative. They say racial discrimination or gender discrimination or something like that. And they use the word discrimination to mean bias. But discrimination does not mean bias. However, because everybody thinks it means bias, they have a reaction when they hear that word. In fact, the poor dictionary has been lost and forgotten, but if you consult the dictionary, especially the old ones, they will tell you that discrimination means that you can tell one thing from another. It's the power to know the difference. And of course it's used for race discrimination and gender discrimination because people perceive another human being according to the body, according to whether it's a male or a female body, or according to the color of the body. And what spiritual knowledge tells us is it is not a very realistic, reasonable, sensible, wise, or intelligent to evaluate something on the basis of something that it isn't. And a person isn't a body. But the consciousness of the body is so powerful that it's very difficult for a human being to look at another human being and think and feel and behave as if that person is neither male nor female, as if that person doesn't have a body color. You know, there are other things like language, class, whether you're beautiful or not beautiful, or so many different physical attributes are applied by the intellect to evaluate a person, and the conclusion that they arrive at will be false because they are not looking at the being, they're looking at the body and judging the being according to the body. So the intellect in a spiritually activated person will be used to evaluate the being on the basis of the being, not on the basis of the body. So how do you use the intellect to evaluate a person on the basis of their being? So a person expresses themselves by their words and their action. So you will evaluate a person on the basis of what they say. Now, they may be lying. And if a person is lying, you may not be able to catch that with the intellect, whereas the mind will catch it. So this is an interesting distinguishing characteristic of the mind, that you can feel something false in the vibration, which the intellect may not catch. But then the mind may get it wrong, because the mind is contaminated by certain things. The intellect is contaminated by the consciousness of matter, and the mind is contaminated by different types of traumatic experiences. And so it becomes very complicated to extricate the mind and the intellect from these things. And you were asking about what is a divine intellect. So a divine intellect is one which is not anymore contaminated by assuming that something material is something spiritual, and vice versa. Then comes the matter of perception. The intellect needs the mind in order to refine its capacity to discern and detect and catch what's really real. And the mind needs the intellect to be grounded, to be based in real reality as opposed to perhaps imagined reality, because the mind doesn't know the difference between right and wrong, good and bad, real or unreal. And the intellect does. But going back to the example I gave before, that someone may be lying, and with your intellect you can't detect it, but with your mind you feel something not right about the vibration, and then you will get an alert. Then the intellect will have to check, and sometimes it's quite difficult to check these things, but at least you would have a suspicion and you would not be easily fooled. So a divine intellect is where the mind and the intellect are working together very, very perfectly and beautifully, and the mind is clean, the intellect is unpolluted, and this is an ideal situation. So in spiritual practice, what we try to do is to refine the intellect and the mind. And in terms of analysis, you can say there's a mind over here, and then there's an intellect over there, and then there are sanskaras on the other side, but they are working together all the time, so you can't really separate them. But for the purpose of understanding these different functionings of consciousness, it is divided into these three categories. So a divine intellect is able to process ideas that are not based on matter. An intellect which is not divine can't do that. So what kind of ideas are those? These are ideas to do with the description and definition of non-material realities. So those realities are specific. One of them is souls. Souls are non-material, but they are beings. And they manifest themselves through bodies, so it's undeniable, even though a lot of people deny it. The second thing is God. God is quite difficult for people to perceive and to catch and to understand. So a lot of people, they believe in God, but they can't necessarily perceive God. But they can have experiences which they will say, I had an experience of God, but it's not something that you can prove or replicate or demonstrate to have been done in a number of cases, because it's very subjective. Then the third area is what we call the soul world and the subtle world. So the soul world is known as nirvana, and there are people who believe there is such a thing and people who believe that there isn't, because through the scientific method you cannot say anything about those soul or God or the world of souls, the world of nirvana, because they're outside the range of the scientific method. So information about these things is called revealed knowledge. And revealed knowledge is something that is revealed to humanity by God, who is said to be the one who knows everything. So what kind of everything does God know is that which is outside the range of the scientific method. And then to know whether it's true or not, you still have to apply the intellect as much as you can to verify it and validate it for yourself. So when the intellect is divine, you can use it to verify and recognize things which are not physical. Like, first of all, you have to recognize yourself as a soul. And you can do that on the basis of the information. So the information about a soul, it tells you that a soul is a point. And according to geometry, a point has no length or width or height or thickness. But the intellect can understand it, even though it's not something that you can detect using the sense perception. This is a purely intellectual function. That the definition of a point is something that you cannot have in the material world, but you can understand that the soul can be a point and still not material with that description. And so there is a very wonderful way where the intellect can cross over to the world of non-matter. And this is very important because it is in the intellect that you have to process the information about the soul to be able to do spiritual practice. And then the intellect, filled with divine information, works with the mind to focus on the self and experience the self. And then the next step in meditation is for the intellect and the mind together, using the understanding of God also as a point, and focus the point of the self on the point of God. And when you do that, you are no longer in the world of matter, and you have gone into another dimension purely by the power of focused thought. And the intellect has been able to let go of matter because a point is non-material. And then the mind works with the intellect to experience the qualities of the soul and the qualities of God, because qualities are also non-material. How much space does love take up? What is the volume of the ocean of peace? It's outside the range of matter, but yet the intellect and the mind can work with these ideas and have the experience of what that is through focus. And then there is the spiritual connectedness, and you arrive at a state of fulfillment. So we need to use the intellect for this. The intellect is important because it's like a muscle, and the mind is like a sense organ which can sense things that are very, very subtle, and it flutters around like a butterfly. So the intellect needs to use its capability of focus to hold the mind steady. Because when the mind is steady, then the experience that you can have by being focused, point to point, point of the soul to the point of God, and then you can be still enough to feel the very, very subtle qualities of God. So the intellect can hold the mind steady, and when the mind is engaged and drawing a power and feeling the qualities, then it's ready to sit quiet. So this is what meditation is about. But our souls are polluted, contaminated, not strong, confused, damaged, corroded, so many things have happened. And we tend to be able to have just glimpses of this state of connectedness. And we will practice to do this by engaging the intellect and the mind. But the mind is such that if you give it the same thing you gave it yesterday, it'll say, I already had that, already did that, I need something new. So all the time the mind will only be satisfied when there is something new. So the intellect has to work with the study to arrive at different nuances, different angles on the truth that God tells us, so that the mind will say, "Oh yes, let me feel that one," and then it'll do it. But then after a while, it loses that connectedness and flies around again. So consciousness is very subtle, and the elements within consciousness are very subtle. And why do we get so distracted? Is because there's no power. So the intellect is a very important instrument to get us to get power, because the intellect has to hold the mind in contact with the Supreme Being long enough and steady enough for the mind to feel and absorb the energy that comes from God, the Supreme Soul. And that can only flow when the mind is still and the intellect is focused. And what gets in the way is, I think, probably karmic accounts, together with just weakness of the soul. When the soul is weak, it gets easily distracted, can't focus. You need strength to focus. So the meditation practice that we do, which is quite disciplined, is for the purpose of generating strength, so that the muscle of the intellect gets stronger and stronger to be able to neutralize and resist the distractions or pulls of karma and hold steady and clearly in focus. So that is the intellect. And now you might say, oh, well, I don't know about this word intellect, but we have to have a word. The original word that we learn is buddhi for this function, and we translate it as intellect, but in many ways it's not normal to use the word intellect in this way in English. So it's a kind of jargon word that you kind of use this word to mean this, even though if you use this word with other people, they have another meaning of intellect. So the normal meaning of intellect is something a little bit more academic. And but we don't really have a word in English that exactly covers the full meaning of the word buddhi as it is used in India. And the reason is because of the culture. So the culture in India is deeply connected with the history of the religion and spirituality and the scriptures and so on. And the Western world is more of a Judeo-Christian world where you think differently and you use words to mean something that is there in your culture. And so using the word intellect is just an approximation that we have no choice about, really, and it is our custom. so we use it for this. But it's deep, and this is why I think it's good to use multiple words like intelligence, like reason, like conscience, evaluation, focus. All these things apply to the word buddhi. There's another word which we have in Hindi, buddhi yoga, and generally in our translations we use the term yoga of the intellect, but in English that doesn't really have any meaning at all. So what does it really mean is focus of attention. So in that sense, the intellect is the ability of the soul to focus attention on one thing as opposed to something else. And then you engage your attention, your mind, your consciousness, and you absorb into your being that which you're focused on, and whatever you're not focused on doesn't really enter your consciousness. Sometimes you will be distracted because the intellect is not able to focus strongly on something in the face of a sense perception that pulls your attention somewhere else. So the intellect is the part of the consciousness that makes decisions. You decide that you are not going to pay attention to sense perception for some particular period of time, and on condition that there's no big urgency. You will judge what an unnecessary distraction is, and in advance you will decide not to be distracted. It's a function of the intellect. And the muscle of the intellect is indicated by how successful it is in not getting distracted. So there are some people who just do one thing at a time, and there are other people who multitask. And sometimes humanity is divided into the multitask type people, which are more women, more able to do this, and men more comfortable with just doing one thing at a time. And so there are these variations. It's not totally only women who multitask and only men who focus on one thing. There's huge variations, but in a general way, people feel that way. So the user guide to the intellect. Well, we have to see what we think, what we feel about our intellect. What is your relationship with your intellect? How important is it for you to have that clarity, that capacity to focus, concentration? In some ways, meditation is concentration. So you have to be concentrated, undistracted. And when the intellect is strong, you can do that. When the intellect is weak, you have difficulty. So everyone's intellect could be improved, and this is why practice is a good thing. And when you practice, you get stronger, you get more competent, more experienced, and you take command, you take charge of the functioning of your intellect, you take responsibility. So another aspect of the intellect is accountability. In your intellect, you determine your karma. Your mind may say, oh, you know, this is so nice, I want to do this over here. And your intellect will say, okay, but if you do that, there's a cost. do you want to pay that price? So the mind will say, well, I don't care, and the intellect will say, I do care. And so in those cases, there's a conflict between the mind and the intellect. So what's more important, the intellect or the mind? You have to decide. Because the intellect is steady, stable, the one that absorbs spiritual knowledge and understands the criteria for right and wrong and can calculate the cost of different actions. In many ways, it's good to put the intellect in the place of importance. But you always have to be very flexible about this, because there are many instances where it becomes more important to listen to the voice of the heart and the voice of the mind. But the heart and the mind is one thing, And sometimes something is so important, but only the heart can feel it and recognize it, and the intellect is left behind. So you need to be subtle enough, flexible enough, and sensitive enough to determine, do I put my heart first? Do I put my intellect first? So let us take a moment here to think about this for a moment or two, and then you may have some questions, and then towards the end we can have some deep silence to think about these things more deeply. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sister Denise. A lot for us to unpack there.
Sorry.
Oh, it's great. It's great. So let me come to a few questions. So here is one. It's about the divine intellect. And Baba says that he gives us the divine intellect as a birthday gift when we come to him. What does that mean?
To me, if I carry myself back to the day when I first listened to the knowledge of the soul, and I was really astounded because I had been thinking about consciousness and soul for years and sort of researching it as best as I could, but then Sister Janti had given me the course, and she laid it out, exactly what the soul is, and my intellect went, wow, because everything fell into place. It was ready to fall into place, but it was not in place. And I can't remember which thing exactly, but I think it's just the whole combination of all the information, and then all of a sudden I could really see what it is. So seeing and understanding are kind of interchangeable words, and to me the divine intellect is when God tells you what you need to know so that you can see the truth for what it is, and then after that everything is different, because it calls everything into question. You have to do a lot of thinking to reset your perception and comprehension of reality. So that was special. And I think he calls it a birthday gift, because most of us have this experience that on the day when you get it is the day when you're born. And so, yeah, it is a gift. It is a very amazing and special thing, and it doesn't go away. Sometimes you might put it on the back burner or lose it, but it's there. Once you've got it, that's it.
co-host. So here is another question. Somebody asks, heart of the soul and awareness, can we say it is in the intellect?
The heart of the soul, to me, the heart of the soul is the mind, or the deep mind, and the feeling. The intellect has no feeling, but the mind doesn't know the difference between yes and no. So awareness, in some ways you could say awareness is an intellectual thing, and in some ways you could say awareness is a mind thing, where you feel it, you see it, you get it. And these words are also translations of Hindi words, like, for example, very often we will use the word awareness for smriti. And smriti is awareness, but is that awareness in the mind when the intellect has given it sufficient information that you can feel it? Maybe that is it, yeah. But it's so subtle, and you can look at it from different angles, and it's subjective too.
Okay, so a few questions coming up now. So someone asks, what kind of practices help the intellect to strengthen according to your insights?
Well, what I learned from Dadi Janki, she told me that Baba had told her that if she really wants to catch up and move ahead, she thought she came late in Gyan because it was 6 months after the others. He told her, read the Murali 12 times in a day. And she started to do that, and even 24 times. And this is really the thing, because the only tangible thing we have about God or of God is what he says. And what he says is written down in the Murli. So for you to have direct access to the mind of God, that's the Murli. And so when you study the Murli, that means you read it over and over and over. It's like an instrument which, when you work it, when you read it many times, you start to make it move, and you start to make it open up like a kind of Rubik cube, and then it will show you stuff. And in the process of that, your intellect gets clarified and strengthened. And so I have always followed Dadi in these things, and I have found that it's absolutely true. And the intellect is black and white, ink on paper, and it's a direct thing. It's a tangible thing. It's not very kind of movable like the sort of rainbow colors of the mind. And it really is, no matter what your situation is, you go to the Murli, you work the Murli, you will get where you have to get. But you have to put in the work. There's a lot of resistance.
Okay, thank you. Here's another one. It's about the stone intellect.
Okay.
So how does an intellect become stone? And is Baba referring only to BKs when he says this?
Well, a diamond is also a stone, and a piece of granite is also a stone. Crystalline, but still it's opaque. So a stone intellect is one where you cannot see, and a diamond intellect is one where you can see. So it's really about that. And I think he is sometimes talking to BKs who get it and then they lose it, because in order for you to keep this absolute clarity, you have to shift into the confluence age and not go wandering off into the iron age, which means You have to have purity. When you mix up wrong information with right information, your clarity will become opaque and you will get a stone intellect. You will not be able to process ideas effectively or accurately, and then you will go and make the wrong decisions. And if you understand the knowledge but yet you contaminate it with different desires or ego problems or whatever, and you become on some level dishonest or disloyal to truth, then you lose access, you lose the right to see clearly, and then you get a stone intellect like that. So be careful, because it's very precious and it's easy to get contaminated, and you have to be careful.
Okay, so a few more questions coming up. Here's the next one. Is it possible to really understand the soul as it is with the intellect, or is it more an experience like in divine vision, or like you said, the mind catching the full, deep reality of the soul?
Well, to me, this is called Gyan Yoga, Raj Yoga, Gyan Yoga. It gives a lot of importance to the intellect because the intellect doesn't get interfered with by what we call Maya, and the mind does. So you can get all kinds of divine visions which are not divine, and get very distracted from mixing up your desires and this and that. To me, you can really understand the soul with the intellect, but if you want to experience the soul, which of course you do, you need to get the mind and the intellect working together, and for that you need as much possible purity, and you must practice. This is not something you can get in 5 minutes, and there's a saying in India that, you can't really be a yogi until you've been practicing for 50 years, and people say, 50 years, but it's because the refinement process takes time and focused attention, and there are many, many things in the way of it. So we have to be patient. Daddy Janki always used to say to us, you really need patience, you have to work at this very conscientiously, and don't expect to arrive at the destination in 5 minutes. That's not realistic. So yeah, we have to be plodders, but we have to keep moving,
All right, thank you. Somebody asks about faith in the intellect. How do you understand faith in the intellect?
The thing is this, you can understand something and it's clear to you, but then a little bit later, because of karmic accounts, because of the impact of impurity, you can't see it anymore. And so to have faith in the intellect is, once you've understood it, even if you can't feel it, you still know that it is so. And you have to go on the basis of what you know, rather than sort of flitting around on the basis of feelings which keep changing from 1 minute to the next. So that is faith in the intellect, as far as I'm concerned.
Next one is about the mind. Can the mind based on feelings inspire the intellect to make a decision?
Oh, I'm sure it can, but it might not make a good one.
Okay, well, that's very clear. All right, and somebody asks about affirmations. Would you recommend affirmations to strengthen the intellect, such as the main virtues of the soul?
Well, an affirmation is a statement, not a virtue. And we have this word mantra, and a mantra is a piece of advice, and a lot of affirmations, traditional affirmations, are that sort of thing. So in BK we have some mantras like Om Shanti, for example. I am a soul at peace. You may be a disturbed, peaceful soul, but you remind yourself, though I may be feeling disturbed, but I am essentially a peaceful being. That's an affirmation. But if you want to talk about the original qualities of the soul, like peace, I just mentioned, or love, you can affirm that you are a soul at peace, a loving soul, a pure soul, which will help you to counteract feelings that are the opposite of it, and that helps you to come back to the reality, which is maybe different from what you're feeling at that moment, because feelings are deceptive. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. There's a question about trance, that what role does the mind and the intellect play in trance?
Well, trance is a gift, and if Baba pulls the string and brings you to the subtle region and gives you an experience or a message or something like that, for that you have to have a completely plain and open mind, but it's very few people who do not mix up the stuff of their mind. And Adi Gulzar was basically the only one who never mixed anything in to the trance messages and so on. This is why she became the medium for Bab-Dada, and that is her speciality. Because otherwise, in these subtle experiences, especially the mind will mix in all kinds of things. And so you'll find in the Murli it says Maya interferes in trance, and therefore it's strongly discouraged, because people don't have that kind of pure mind and powerful, pure, clear intellect these days. Those are very special, very rare.
Okay, thank you. Then there's a question about some terms Baba uses for the intellect, like a far-sighted intellect or a broad intellect. So what is that?
Yeah, it has to do with, sometimes he says you have to see the past, present and future of everything. You have to not be narrow-minded, so we use this expression narrow-minded. We have to be broad-minded, like that. And we use the word mind, but in Baba's expressions it's intellect. So because very often in English we use the word mind, where in Hindi you would use the word buddhi. So it creates confusion. But a far-sighted intellect is that you can figure out in advance where things are going. You can see the trends, and you take into consideration a much wider, long-term set of understandings, and that you don't just operate on the basis of what's immediately in front of your nose, like that.
Okay, so intellect overheating with lots of rich gyan coming through.
Okay, well don't boil over.
So let's make this maybe the last question. Okay. You mentioned about multitasking. You said generally soul in female body is able to multitask. Generally, soul in male body more focused. Why is it different? What, is it a brain thing, or what makes the difference?
I don't know really what it is, but it does seem to be like that. And You know, I'm a person who can multitask, and sometimes I will not pay sufficient attention on one thing, and someone will feel, oh, you're not listening to me because I'm doing 25 other things at the same time. And so in that case, it's kind of not good. And then if you are a person who can just only do one thing at a time, and if somebody tries to pull your attention to something else, it really causes you a problem, because you cannot hold a number of things at the same time. So the tendency, the overall tendency, seems to be that way between males and females. And you know, there's a song, I can't remember who sung it, but it's called I'm a Woman. And it talks about how she is looking after the house, the child, the husband, all sorts of things all at once. Why? Because I'm a woman. So it seems there is something like that. Might be to do with the brain, might be an effect of culture, biology, circumstances, who knows. But it seems to be a bit of a phenomenon. And you know, there's it's 6 of one and half a dozen of the other, of which is better, because you need to have some sort of a good balance where you're not too extreme one side or the other.
You say Brahma Baba was balanced in both, and that's why he was who he was?
I think Brahma Baba was able to switch very fast, and he was able to focus on what he had to focus on for the time he had to focus on it, and as soon as he didn't have to anymore, then he would switch, and particularly he would switch to going into the stage of remembrance. People used to speak about this. They would say they would come and have a meeting with Brahma Baba, and he would talk to them, and then when it was over, he'd be gone. And another thing they would say about him is that people would come to Brahma Baba with all sorts of questions, and after the first or second word, he got it, and he would stop them from saying any more, because he knew what the thing was, and he would give the answer. So he was really saving time, and he was very impatient, not in a negative sense, but there's no point in somebody telling something that takes 10 minutes, which he could figure out in 2 seconds. And so he wouldn't allow them to take that 10 minutes, because it was his valuable time. And we are always taught, you know, don't waste your time. And if you can catch something in 2 seconds, which otherwise takes 20 minutes to say, don't wait for the 20 minutes, but trust your perception and go with that. But then, of course, sometimes people get it wrong. So, again, you have to be very clear. And Brahma Baba was very clear. Very clear.
There are some more questions coming through, but I think we do need to wrap up, and perhaps those which are unanswered, you can ask them another time to Sister Denise. As you know, she's a lot on the in cyberspace, so find her floating around somewhere there. And I know you'd said we should finish with silence, but at the end we also ask everyone to open their cameras so you can see everyone, and we'll make that the last thing. Okay. So should we have a moment of silence first?
Definitely.